good afternoon or good late morning, depending on where you are. My name is Ben Korb. I am the Public Affairs Director for the American Society for Biochemistry and Molecular Biology, and I want to thank you for your time and participation and interest in our teletown hall, which is focusing on issues related to immigration and international collaboration in science, which have become some pretty critically important issues, particularly during a global pandemic, in which certainly the fact that science is international has been highlighted. And the administration has made several policy changes that have impacted the collaboration and the free exchange of science and the free exchange of information and knowledge and people across borders to study and to conduct science. A couple of quick ground rules about what we're doing. First off, this meeting is recorded. So if you do not want to be recorded, you can choose to not ask a question or raise your hand or vocalize, or you can choose to leave. And I'm not saying that rudely, but I just want to let you know that we are recording this conversation. We are hoping that this is exactly that, a conversation. We at ASBMB are looking for recommendations and guidance from our membership and from the scientific community about what issues are affecting them, how you're feeling, what you're experiencing out in the field, which is probably very different than what I'm experiencing here in my home office and Serena is experiencing in hers, and what we're reading about in emails and in news articles that we're seeing. So this is a really critically important, actually, intelligence gathering opportunity for us to take a temperature of what's happening. So we really hope and encourage engagement from our attendees as well as from our panelists. So this is, again, intended to be a conversation. So please bring your thinking caps, bring your opinions, bring your perspectives. If you would like to participate in the conversation, there are, of course, this is Zoom, several options for you. You can chat, you can use the chat window. Serena is dutifully going to be sitting around and hanging out in there, helping out. Also, you can raise your hand and we'll go ahead and do our very best to acknowledge your hand being raised and turn on your camera and microphone, or turn on your microphone, and you can choose to turn on your camera to ask your question or to share your perspective and to tell us kind of what you're experiencing. So that is kind of how we're going to operate this. There are some people who are more important than I who are going to be taking over the discussion from here. So first, I want to introduce Serena Niote. Serena is the Public Affairs Manager for ASBMB, and she's going to be your moderator for this discussion. So thank you for taking that on. And then we have two really high caliber, wonderful speakers. John Neumann, who is one of two managing directors of the Science, Technology, Assessment, and Analytics team at the GAO, the Government Accountability Office. And John Yang, who's the president of the Asian Americans Advancing Justice organization. So with that, I'm going to hand the moderating duties on over to Serena, and I appreciate everyone's participation and look forward to a great conversation.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ben. So like he said, international collaboration, immigration have both been very interesting and active areas since the beginning of the pandemic in March. So we know that there have been a lot of changes, and as Ben mentioned, you all have been experiencing those changes. So this is really an opportunity for you to ask us any questions about policy changes, international collaboration, immigration policy, visa requirement changes. But more importantly, we really want to hear from you. We want to hear about your experiences, your concerns, the challenges you're facing, and all of that will help us inform our advocacy efforts. So the structure of the webinar, first, John Neumann from the GAO will be giving us some information, a brief overview of government policies, how they impact STEM and maintaining U.S. competitiveness in STEM. We want to still be attracting foreign talent through scholarship programs, international students, etc. That's really, really important to maintaining the American research enterprise. And then we'll be hearing from John Yang, who has a very extensive legal background. So he'll be talking a lot about the impact immigration has on STEM, on the STEM workforce, and the pandemic's impact on immigration policy and visa changes. And then from there, we'll have a discussion Q&A, so please feel free to use the Q&A box to type in any questions, and I'll read them out loud for the panelists, Ben and I, to answer. Again, please be vocal and active. That's the only way that we can really do our best as a scientific community. So raise your hand, I'll be happy to unmute you, and there will be a few poll questions throughout as well, so we can kind of gauge where you are and what you're feeling. So I'm going to kick it off with John Neumann.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay,
Good.
great. All right. Thanks, Ben and Serena, for inviting me today to talk about international collaboration, immigration, and STEM workforce. I'm John Neumann, as Ben mentioned, and I'm the co-managing director of a new mission team at GAO called the Science, Technology, Assessment, and Analytics Team. We formed it last year in order to better address Congress's science and technology needs in terms of analysis, the whole range of analysis from oversight, which is our traditional audit work that GAO produces, insight, which is best practice guides and other helpful ways to assess how well programs are operating, and then foresight work, which is the more scientific of the work that we do, looking at technology assessments of emerging technology areas. And for those of you who don't know GAO, we're an independent legislative branch agency, nonpartisan. We get our work from both the majority and minority, and every audit or project we take on, we start off by assessing, what are the objectives that we believe should be answered in the most straightforward way, and ensuring that there isn't bias in the process. So I think to help set up the discussion today, I thought I would talk about a report we did 2 years ago that's most closely related to this topic. GAO is in a unique position in that we can look across the federal government and across policies and programs, as well as talk to industry, academia, and other stakeholders that are affected by federal programs and policies to make our assessments and provide our reports to the Congress. So in 2018, we issued a report entitled Considerations for Maintaining U.S. Competitiveness in Quantum Computing, Synthetic Biology, and Other Potentially Transformational Research Areas. For those of you who want to look it up, it's on GAO's website, gao.gov. GAO-18-656 is the report number. And so in this report, we brought together a range of experts from industry, government, academia, to talk about, well, first, just looking at the current state of quantum computing and synthetic biology, but then the third objective of our report was to look at what are the key considerations that the U.S. as a whole, not just government, but the U.S. Research infrastructure enterprise should be thinking about as we want to maintain competitiveness in these emerging technology areas. And the experts agreed on 4 broad areas. The first being knowing when to have a strategic approach for emerging research areas. The second was fostering information sharing, which I'll say a little bit more about in a minute. The third was focusing on technology development and commercialization across multiple stages of the innovation life cycle. And then the fourth area, also pertinent to today's discussion, was strengthening the science and technology workforce through training, recruiting, and retaining talent here in the US. So as I mentioned, 2 of these are more relevant to today's discussion. And the first one I wanted to just say a few words on is fostering information sharing. This includes bringing federal and non-federal stakeholders together to share research and potentially identify any research gaps and share knowledge. This was something the experts highlighted was very critical to our being competitive in these emerging research areas. And they highlighted the need to leverage international research as part of that and promote international collaboration. A good example of the international collaborative research project is the Human Genome Project, which began in 1990 with support from the Department of Energy and the National Institutes of Health. And the goal was to identify all the genes in the human DNA. This effort resulted in within 13 years of the full sequencing of the human genome and had a lot of international collaboration in that process. So as I mentioned, that the experts really thought that these types of things are necessary if you want to speed innovation and overcome obstacles in various knowledge points in emerging research areas. The other key consideration that was another important one for the experts was strengthening the science and technology workforce. This included recruiting and retaining talent, not just from the United States, but from around the world. And historically, this has been a strength of the United States. If you look at past reports from CRS, Congressional Research Service, and the National Science Board, they've shown how scientific breakthroughs in the United States disproportionately come from foreign researchers. In fact, the National Science Board report in 2018 noted that while only 13% of the US population is foreign born, they accounted for 30% of college-educated workers in STEM occupations in the US and 45% of workers with doctorate degrees. But the experts were also very concerned that the US was losing ground for a number of reasons. One being that there are other countries that are willing to take foreign researchers without the same restrictions that we might place on them and are competing with the US for those same researchers. These countries include Canada, China, and Singapore. So this is something that if we are to maintain that, our US competitiveness, we need to think about how do we do this and continue to do this as well as we did in the past. Now, there are a lot of federal programs that affect this issue. And one of the things that came up with the experts when we talked about these transformational research areas was the need to balance open research with economic and national security concerns. Experts did raise the flip side of information sharing, including the foreign commercialization of US intellectual property, the loss of trade secrets. And then also increasingly, there have been national security concerns. And several agencies such as the FBI and Immigration and Customs Enforcement have been involved in various programs that impact the number of foreign students and researchers that are in the country and then how they operate when they are here. In 2018, there were more than 1.2 million foreign students at US universities. And while the vast majority pose no threat to the US, there are increasing cases where there are countries that are targeting US research and the open nature of US research at universities to illicitly acquire technology and bring it back to their home countries. So one of the areas that has been raised recently and GAO did a report on is on export controls at universities. And so there, the university environment is an open research environment, mostly focused on basic research, fundamental research, which would not normally be export controlled. However, the FBI had been stepping up its outreach to the universities because of specific cases where individuals had appropriated US technology and sent it back to their home countries in violation of US export laws. The State and Commerce Department are both charged with implementing various aspects of the export control system, depending on if it's military technology or dual use technology having civilian applications. And in this report, which we issued earlier this year, we found that state and commerce departments were not doing a very good job of providing guidance that was specific to the unique environments of universities. For example, universities typically aren't exporting goods overseas, right? They have people attending conferences, participating in joint research, and sometimes there are emerging technologies that are being discussed there. As long as the information that's being discussed is basic or fundamental research, there are no concerns. But the guidance that the state and commerce departments provide really are focused on exporters who are trying to sell weapons and other dual-use technologies overseas. And they didn't adapt them as well as they could have to the university environment. So that definitely causes a lot of angst at universities. We heard from the universities that this can be a costly thing to implement because of the open research environment. And some universities have hired experts to help them manage export controls at their universities, even though they don't believe that they have any export controlled information to protect. So it's an interesting challenge for universities. Obviously, there's some that are engaged in research under contract with the Department of Defense. In those cases, it's very clear what the protection should be. But it's this open research environment that it's not as clear, and the guidance needs to be clarified to ensure that we're not shutting down legitimate open research for the fear of the few cases that have come out. So I think there's a lot of other topics I could get into, but I think with that backdrop, I'd like to turn the floor over to John Yang, and then we can come back and have an open discussion about some of these issues.
Great, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. My name is John Yang. I'm the Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. It's wonderful to be with all of you. And actually, I hope to learn as much from all of you as you possibly could gain from me. Let me give you a little bit of background on my organization, why I'm so interested, our organization is so interested in this. So my organization's a civil rights organization. Our mission is to advance the civil and human rights of Asian Americans and to promote a fair and equitable society for all. So in terms of the issues that we work on, they include discrimination, they include immigration, they include census, and I'm going to put in a plug here to make sure everyone has filled out their census forms. They include voting to make sure everyone can vote in an appropriate manner during COVID-19. And then they also include technology and telecom. So in this particular sphere, it really involves the intersection between our immigration work and some of our discrimination work that we do. And certainly, you know, when we're talking about immigration as it comes to some of these international collaborations, some of these academic studies, you know, we are seeing some dangerous precedents being set, some dangerous policies being established. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, and then again, engage in this conversation with all of you about what you're seeing on the ground. You know, first by way of backdrop, when we talk about immigration as a whole, you know, a lot of people tend to think of that as a Latino issue, and in some ways that's very much true. But with respect to the Asian American community, it's important to recognize that about 90% of us, 92% to be exact, are either immigrants or children of immigrants. And so anytime you talk about immigration, by definition, it involves the Asian American community. And even within that community, there's a huge diversity. You know, we're talking about 50 different races and ethnicities, over 100 different languages being spoken. But then specifically when we start to drill down into this, as we specifically talk about international students and, you know, international academia, John already mentioned it, you know, over 1 million of the international, there's over 1 million international students that come to the United States per year. Out of that, over 75% are from Asia. And then within that, over half of them are from China and India. So sort of when we talk about international students, how that intersects with immigration, that's why my organizations like mine have a sort of very deep interest in what is happening here. You know, and we come at it from the notion that immigration has always helped this country, right? You know, just the basic tenet of the United States is that other than Native Americans that were here for centuries, thousands of years, other than African Americans that were brought here as slaves forcibly, you know, all of us are immigrants, and that is part of what has made this country great. You know, if you talk about sort of at a meta level, you know, the Fortune 500 companies, out of these Fortune 500 companies, they've produced about 8.3 trillion in wealth for the United States per year. And those are the ones, only the ones that for which immigrants or second generation immigrants, children of immigrants, were the founders of those companies, right? And then there are obviously famous examples of immigrants that have, whether it is Jerry Yang of Yahoo, whether it is the creator of Google, that are first generation immigrants that have built tremendous industries, tremendous innovation for the United States. But then even at a micro level, you know, what we're talking about here is with respect to the STEM field. You know, I think John mentioned some of the statistics. About 19% of bachelor's holders in the STEM field working in the United States are immigrants. You know, about over 50% of PhD STEM field workers are immigrants. And notice that I emphasize workers. We're not talking about here, this subset of people that get educated in the United States and take that knowledge back to their quote unquote home countries. These are people that are contributing to the United States economy. And so it's sort of, as we think about these policies, especially around immigration policies, it is around how do we encourage people to stay in the United States and innovate for the United States, create for the United States, and help us to create this dynamic environment. And here, you know, let's face it, some of the immigration policies that we've started to see really have turned away some of these scientists, really have turned away some of these academics. You know, whether it is the immigration policies themselves, and here I'm talking about even going as far back, if you will, as the Muslim ban, you know, that has had an impact on our Iranian scientists, our Iraqi scientists, that has had a trickle effect. Even then, we saw it in our community on Chinese scientists that saw that they could be next in this mix, right? And it has discouraged individuals from seeking to come to the United States. You know, I literally have friends that have decided to go to Australia that were biologists, that were engineers, because of the fact that they saw the United States as an increasingly hostile place to be. And then we see that in the statistics. You know, whereas if you look at foreign graduates that received work permits to work in the United States back in 2017, we hit a record high of about 275,000. Since then, that growth rate has gone dramatically down. It used to be we had a growth rate in terms of foreign workers here in the United States of about 30%. Now the growth rate is maybe around 8%, probably even a little bit less than that. And some of that is due to increased scrutiny of immigrants in terms of their ability to get work visas, in terms of their ability to get permanent residency, and increased scrutiny just in terms of the different policies that were enacted. I think certainly we mentioned at the outset that COVID-19 has an effect. It certainly has had an effect. We've seen these quote unquote immigration bans. We've seen, whether it's related to COVID-19 or not, you know, the bans on international students, the bans on certain students from China that might be associated with specific Chinese universities. Now, let me be clear here. You know, I agree with John. There is truly national security threats that all of us must be concerned about. And I don't deny that in any way. But there is a way for us, as I always say, to walk and chew gum at the same time. You know, there's a way for us to encourage scientists to come here to really help the United States continue to innovate, at the same time being mindful of our national security concerns. And here, sort of one thing that I would offer is some of the things that the FBI currently is doing is really causing some great concern within specifically the Chinese community, the Chinese American community, but I do think probably the academic community as a whole. And this goes to what I see as changing standards, right? So this isn't even immigration policy, but this is law enforcement policy. You know, whereas even as far, you know, early back, so to speak, as, you know, 2014, 2013, obviously academics were encouraged to collaborate with each other, were encouraged to sort of have these visiting professorships. Now what we are seeing is professors that are getting charged for criminal violations for failure to disclose that they were an adjunct professor at a Chinese university, or get compensation of some sort at a Chinese university, a Chinese think tank, or a Chinese company. Now, again, I'm going to be very blunt and say, you know, maybe in those situations that failure to disclose should have employment consequences. Maybe if they failed to disclose compensation, it should have tax consequences for failure to report revenue. I don't deny those, but for those to lead to criminal charges is where we do have a significant concern with some of what's happening within, you know, the FBI and within law enforcement ranks. And again, we need to take a hard look at that. You know, there are laws in place for economic espionage that should be used, but a number of the more recent cases that we are seeing are prosecutions for what are called these failure to disclose, and then they wrap them around into a federal charge called wire fraud. Now, wire fraud, for those that don't know, that encompasses a whole range of quote unquote acts or crimes, so that as long as you are getting paid your salary through a bank transfer, a wire transfer, that can constitute wire fraud. So again, sort of as we think about these policies, how do we encourage collaboration? One thing that I would ask all of you, and as we go into these discussions in terms of what are we asking for from our government? What are we asking for in terms of policies? It goes to this clearer guidance that John was talking about, is let's make sure that we have some rules in place that make sense. Let's educate the people that are coming to this country so that they know what rules are in place. Because again, some of these are issues that would not have been issues 5 years ago, but that are now being pulled up as a basis for charges that are, in my mind, not commensurate with the act that was actually committed. So let me stop there. I think the other piece, let me offer one final piece, which is that, you know, I focused a little bit on sort of this national security piece. The last piece I would say is this is not an issue that's recent. if you look at the backlog in visas, in the needed visas for the United States, that's existed for a long time. If you're talking about H-1B visas, if you're talking about visas for certain categories, especially for immigrants from China and India, they could go back as far as 20 years. And so part of it is, if we are trying to encourage talent into the United States, making sure that we have immigration policies that does that. And it's not simply encouraging more work visas for these, skilled workers, but making sure that they have a pathway to bring their family over, right? Because if we want them to settle in the United States, we have to have a family immigration policy that allows them to bring their families over quickly, because that's another way that we will encourage the talent that we develop here through academia, through schools, to remain here to contribute to our economy. I'll admit, when I say all of that, it sounds a little bit odd coming from someone that is a civil rights lawyer, but I do think that this is one area where our interests definitely intersect, is that we have better civil rights, we have better immigration policies, if we also recognize the economic benefit that is provided by having these strong values-based economic policies. Thank you.
Great, thank you both. Those were really wonderful introductory remarks, and I think that they set the tone for a good discussion moving forward. So you both touched on attracting foreign talent. So I have a poll that I've launched for our attendees with 2 questions. Do you think the US is still competitive when it comes to attracting foreign talent? And do you think the US has had fewer scientists seeking collaboration with the United States and with researchers based in the US since January 2020? So I'll actually ask the question to both of you first, so hopefully to get people to start thinking. Do you think the US is still attracting significant foreign talent despite all the recent changes?
Okay, well, let me start by saying that I think where the US may have an advantage is the amount of money that it has to spend on research. I mean, it's still, clearly a leader worldwide in terms of research spending, around $70 billion per year. And so I think because of that, there is still, a lot of, the center of gravity still is here. The problem is that research funding is at risk. There's definitely budgetary pressures that could affect that. And I think there are other countries that are upping their efforts to target, the research, particularly in certain emerging areas. So that's where I would be more concerned. Is we've seen, at least we heard from experts on their transformational research work, that some of the emerging areas are being developed in other countries. And so the US may not be able to retain and attract the foreign talent unless it's doing that kind of research in a coordinated way that brings people together. And so that was one of the reasons why experts thought that a strategic approach to some of these research areas would be useful, so that we could be thinking about, what areas should we be staying, competitive in, and making sure we have research funding for.
I would agree. I think, are we still very competitive? Yes. But are we top of class? It's a closer call now. And there's a number of reasons for that. A part of it is some of these policies that we're talking about. And some of it is the environment that we are in. I think, some of the racial justice issues that we've seen, again, coming from my lens, have caused people to think about whether this is a worthwhile long-term investment in the United States. I think a lot of people, again, speaking from the Asian population for whom I work, a lot of them want to come to the United States because they believe in the freedoms that this country has to offer, because they believe in the openness that this country has to offer. And I don't think that has changed, although there are now seeds of doubt about that because of some of the more recent events.
Right. And, you mentioned the seeds of doubt. That actually it reflects pretty clearly in the poll that we just took of all the attendees, where 66% still believe that the US is competitive, but 22% think that that's changed pretty significantly since January. And that is where we've seen a lot of changes, especially affecting international students, which is where I'd like to go next, just because that's such a huge component of the American research enterprise. And, you know, as we're talking, I still really encourage our attendees to raise your hand, add to the discussion. Please feel free to ask us questions, either in the Q&A section, chat box, or again, raising your hand. And we'd love to hear, you know, voices from the community themselves instead of just the three of us up here. But yeah, attracting international students has been, in my personal opinion, difficult the past 6 months with the changes with university policies, with student visas. John, do you mind talking a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, we haven't done any recent work on the student visas, you know, that would cover the recent events. Certainly, we're doing, you know, more broad work looking at, you know, how agencies are being impacted by COVID and the shutdowns and all that. But I think from the student visa standpoint, I mean, there's definitely, the last report that we did on it did talk about some of the cases where there is potential for fraud in students coming here misrepresenting themselves. And so the focus of the student visa program, you know, seems to be more on the security aspects. The question that I have, and we did not cover this in the report that I worked on in the transformational research, you know, how does that kind of, you know, is there some mechanism to ensure that the broader national interests of maintaining U.S. competitiveness, is that being factored into how these programs are being managed? And so part of the challenge there is that they're, you know, run by different agencies that have different missions and are focused on different aspects. And that's why it's so important that we have interagency efforts, and this can be done at the White House level through the Office of Science and Technology Policy, where there are a number of working groups that look at across the federal government to make sure that we're working in sync and that agencies are coordinating with each other on related issues. So I think that's maybe where this issue could be looked at that level.
Maybe the one thing I would add about that is it's not even so much the policies, because some of these policies that we've seen have been revoked pretty quickly, or the manner in which they were implemented ended up fizzling out, if you will, right? I'm thinking about the so-called ban on international students as being one that was revoked very quickly after a lawsuit was filed. But it is, and this part is not as measurable, is the effect it has on those students that are in those countries and their willingness to apply to the United States. Because I think that's the trickle effect that is not just a trickle, but a steady flow that we're gonna see for years to come.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And there's one comment in the chat saying in Myanmar, there is only one PhD biochem holder from the US. He is now 96 years old. We are hoping for government-to-government collaboration and offering scholarship program. So that definitely seems like one example where hopefully there's more movement in the future to increase collaboration. And May, if you'd like to say anything, feel free to raise your hand to add to that, and I'll be happy to unmute you. So while we were talking about, you know, encouraging international students and how to keep them here, I launched another poll because they're really fun to do to estimate people of how much of their lab employees are international students. And about 31% say that between like a quarter and a half of their labs are run by international students, which is huge. I mean, that's a very large pool of talent for researchers to pull from. And even, you know, the smallest portion is less than a quarter, which 11 people said, like, that's still a quarter of international students is still really important. And Ben, I think there is a Q&A question for you to take.
There is. This question comes in. One point raised was the issue of scientists at U.S. universities not reporting outside activities, which most universities require, especially when they are paid, and ending up in legal trouble, not just university trouble. How do we now get research faculty to disclose these outside activities ahead of time within universities? I fear now some people will have even more, will be even more hesitant to declare their associations. I'm wondering if either John, either of the Johns would like to go ahead and take that question.
Well, it just so happens we're in the midst of reviewing that exact issue, a conflict of interest for researchers and how agencies, manage that process. So I can't talk about that since it's ongoing, but we'll be hopefully issuing that report later this year, by the end of the calendar year, early next year, and definitely can talk about that. I think what I can say about it is that it's a concern that has been raised. There have been hearings on it in Congress. And I think in many of these cases, when we look at these programs, we identify ways to help improve the implementation, and that's what we hope to do here. And that may be needed. We'll see.
I think this is where we have to work with law enforcement also to sort of, for lack of a better term, think through sort of what amnesty looks like, think through what sort of repair work looks like, or some version, right? So that people recognize, okay, these standards have changed, and so let's clean all of this up, give a grace period for which that can be cleaned up, and then sort of have enforcement on a going forward basis. And again, here, I think for me, it's what does that enforcement look like? Because right now, you're absolutely right. If people think enforcement is criminal time, right? Criminal conviction, criminal prosecution, that absolutely would discourage people from coming out of the woodwork and saying, all right, I screwed up. But if they recognize that, this is part of a process that sort of, yes, maybe I will get a fine, that might look a little bit different. So, I think we all need to recognize it for what it is, that our standards are changing. How do we get ourselves up to date on those standards, if that's the new standard that's going to be applied?
Thank you. One thing I wanted to add also is there are legislative efforts right now in Congress to maybe harmonize what the reporting requirements are across federal agencies, so that scientists are at least have one playbook that they need to follow. But one thing that we've actually brought up to the Senate is what's really would be helpful is providing mechanisms, training, so that they can understand what they should be reporting and what's necessary. So, if the environment is ever changing, and I think most people want to be on the right side of the law and doing the right thing, we need to do a better job of helping them to understand and helping universities to understand what's required, and how scientists can get involved with that. So, Serena, do you want me to take some of the questions in here, or do you want to keep going?
Go ahead.
Great. So there are a couple of questions that have popped up. One here says, I'd be interested to hear more about what the countries that are out-competing the U.S. in recruiting talent are doing. What kinds of policies have been successful in attracting great scientists?
Well, I can, we didn't go into depth in our work on that, but we definitely noted that, countries like Canada, China, and Singapore had, specific programs to attract foreign researchers, offer, specific internships or, funding for it, specifically targeting that. And so I think that's where, the experts that we spoke with were looking for, the U.S. to be better at doing that, so that we are thinking strategically about what kind of talent do we want to have in the United States and how do we get that here, as opposed to assuming that they're just going to come. And we've been great, been able to do that up until now. We may now have to think differently if we want to attract that talent.
All right, we have another question here. The premise of a J-1 visa on which most postdocs come to the US is that a person will go back to their country after completing their training. It takes significant money and effort to stay. How does this correspond to the discussed goal of encouraging people to stay and contribute to the US scientific enterprise? Secondly, in terms of national security, is there a difference between postdoc taking his knowledge back and a PI moving overseas or accepting a second position overseas?
I don't know, John, if you want to talk about that. I'm not a visa expert, but I can say that one of the other pieces that came out in strengthening the S&T workforce was the retention piece, right? And I didn't really talk about that in my comments, but the retention piece is making sure that there are jobs for those foreign researchers and academics to stay in the United States once they have attained the knowledge, so that they're not going back to their home countries. They're contributing to research and innovation here. And so that's something that, the report highlighted as an important piece of ensuring that we have a strong S&T workforce.
And that's actually what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about the E2B and E3B visas rather than so much the J1 visas, right? Is the extent to which those are capped and lead to backlogs might be something that should be looked at, right? Because I agree, sort of converting a J1 does require a fair bit. But sort of this goes more to limits that we have on our overall visas into the United States and paths to citizenship, if you will, right? Because it's one thing to offer all these work visas that are temporary, but sort of the reality is, and there's numerous studies that show this, is that we don't have enough immigrants that are willing to come to the United States and stay, or don't have enough policies that allow immigrants to stay here, right? The reality is we are not reproducing at a rate that is sustainable for our economy. So if that is the case, how do we promote bigger immigration policies, not simply just shuffling the numbers around and expanding E1, E2Bs at the expense of something else, but expanding the programs altogether?
Yeah, absolutely. And do either of you have a comment for that second question? Is there a difference between a postdoc taking his knowledge back and a PI moving overseas or accepting a second position overseas?
What does PI stand for in this context? I'm sorry.
Principal investigator.
Okay.
Sure. So I can start a little bit in just that there is a big difference in a postdoc taking his knowledge back to his country of origin and a PI moving overseas is, first, science is inherently very global. The challenges that we're facing in the 21st century are global challenges, and we're going to need global partnerships to deal with them. So when you're talking about a postdoc taking his knowledge back to his country of origin, by acquiring the knowledge here and then taking it back, he's starting projects in the other countries, and hopefully there's the beginning of fostering a US relationship through that postdoc. And I think a similar thing would be for a PI moving back and forth. Now, as a policy person and not somebody who's ever been on a federal grant, I'm not sure what the big differences are. So if anybody else would like to hop in, please feel free to raise your hand and give your expertise. And I'll also turn it over to either John Yang or John Neumann to add any comments.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I mentioned before, we didn't get into specific visa types, but definitely the experts were noting that the importance of having wherever you have the center of innovation is where you're going to attract the workforce, right? And so I think having kind of some work that they can be involved in after they do their research is going to be important to them staying in the country here, and essentially. Where the research is taking place will decide, which countries, benefit from the, reap the financial rewards of that innovation. And so I think that, yes, it has become much more global, especially with, multinational corporations. But you're looking at it from the U.S. interests standpoint. We want to make sure that we are a player in that, however that would, whatever we decide is the appropriate role. But I think that's where the experts were talking about, the need to create those potential for jobs here in the U.S. by having the innovation, strategically placed here and attracting, researchers from around the world to us, as opposed to having to go to another country to do that research.
So I'll read out a comment as well that we have here. I agree with John Yang's comment that the atmosphere has a huge impact. At my state university, the biochemistry grad students reported incidences that reflected hostility against Asian students, things that change the welcoming atmosphere that allows an international student to feel that the US is home. The current class of 10 new students includes 4 who were unable to start this fall because they did not get student visas to enter the US. These stories will filter back and lead talented applicants to decide that the US is not a place in which they will build their careers. So that's sobering and definitely something we want to try and work against, whether it's through government policies or encouraging, global scientific projects, things like that.
And part of that, unfortunately, it goes beyond policies too, because what we're talking about when we're talking about individual students being denied visas is basically an adjudicator somewhere deciding for some reason that is typically going to be cryptic and unknown to us that that person does not deserve a student visa. And unless that person, that individual, and this is something that our organization tries to look at, unless that individual can cite to some discrimination, cite to something that violates the policy itself, it's going to be very discretionary. And so this is where I think all of us need to work more on the public narrative side to talk about the benefits that these students provide and sort of finding that balance that John is talking about between maintaining that center of innovation here in the United States and while also being mindful of the national security concerns that we should be. Because that's not something that individual laws or individual policies, I think, is going to be able to get at, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. And I think it goes to the general principle of transparency and consistency in the policies and the way they're being implemented. And I think when we do look at all these programs individually or collectively, we look at criteria that assesses, are they engaging with the stakeholders that are impacted by the particular policy to ensure they're getting comments to understand how these things are impacting businesses, universities, individuals. That's all part of the public regulation process that needs to be followed. And if it's not done effectively, then you result in situations where these decisions don't make sense or it's not clear why they were made.
Absolutely. So while we were having that fruitful conversation, I launched another poll on if any of our attendees have experienced, a direct consequence or impact as a result of changing visa restrictions. So about 60% of respondents have had coworkers, trainees, or other STEM students express their concern about changing visa restrictions since the pandemic has started. About 20% have lost researchers directly as a result of the visa changes. And about a third have changed their future research plans because they anticipate hiring fewer international students. So of course, this is a smaller sample size, but even in a small sample size, those are pretty concerning numbers that you're starting to look at the long-term impact of the visa changes, not just what's going on now during a pandemic, but planning for future research projects, trying to keep, an open collaboration and atmosphere. So thank you to all the attendees who have been responding to the polls. It's really been helpful for us to understand, what you're experiencing and where there are areas for us to help. So I have an anonymous comment here that says, I feel like visa holders go through lots of discriminations as well. Less pay, more work, and hard work due to less options to get a grant. NIH would not fund H-1 holder. In those situations, what should the candidate do? First, I will definitely say that please feel free to reach out to ASBMB, either to Ben or myself, and we will try and help you as much as we can. We are doing everything we can to push policies that prevent discrimination or hold those accountable. We really strongly believe that the scientific workforce needs to be diverse and needs to be an open and welcoming environment for everybody. If either of you have any tips.
I think this is an area I would need to understand a little bit more, because certainly in other contexts, we are very concerned about and sort of working on legislation to ensure some type of what I would call worker mobility, right? And this is, not in this context of visas, but worker visas, seasonal worker visas, where employers can take advantage of their visa status and basically hold them to their job for lesser pay. And I think this might have some analogy here. And so the question is sort of, how do we make sure that these visas are not so tied to whether it's universities, whether it's specific jobs, such that the employer has undue influence over the conditions or salary in which they are operating.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So we have another question, and Ben, I hope you don't mind. I might call on you because I think you might have some answers. So the question is, are there actions we can take as independent investigators to promote recruitment and retention of STEM talent? Or is our best course of action to vocally advocate against harmful policies?
So I'm guessing certainly the bottom part of that. I think vocalizing the unintended consequences of these policies is what's really critically important, which is, as was said in the opening, there are some legitimate national security concerns that exist and that are driving a lot of these policy discussions and debates. And administration change would view some of these things differently and approach things differently. But some of the concerns are going to continue as well. I think that your local representatives and your senators need to hear and understand how, when a policy is implemented, how it impacts your lab, the workforce that you're driving, and how things are working on your campus. And making that in a very, very clear, not political case, but just that this is what we're experiencing, and we want you to understand that. And with more conversations like that happening, lawmakers can better understand what those unintended consequences of their policies are. And if you are not comfortable doing that, or if you don't know how to do that and would like help doing that, offices like mine are more than happy to help make the connections for you and help guide you through the conversation and even participate in that conversation, either for you or on your behalf. So that's where I would start with the latter half of that conversation.
I would echo that, because universities are big drivers for members of Congress. And when a university or members of the university speak, it does make a difference. It's one thing for an organization like mine to express concern about some of these issues, but because it's a civil rights organization, there are certain limitations, right? But for sort of the scientific field, for the academic field to echo, to magnify, to amplify these concerns, either through your organization or individually, I've seen it change minds in terms of individual senators saying, whoa, I had never thought of it this way. I still have my concerns about the Chinese government. Well, they should, but let me think through how we should talk about this differently. Even if senators of members of Congress start talking about this differently, we've started to make inroads, because then that goes to that atmosphere that we talked about in the initial segment, right? Is right now the atmosphere that's going back out to a lot of quote unquote home countries is the United States is no longer welcoming. If people are starting to hear these more nuanced messages emanating from all sorts of different sources, then that's another manner in which we could retain some of that competitive edge.
Yeah, and I would also agree with those comments. 90% of the work that GAO does is given to us in the form of request letters from Congress, either the ranking or minority, of the various committees. And many of those requests originate from constituent concerns. And, we take the issue and look at it, objectively across the, the issues and try to provide Congress some analysis of the issues so they can decide how they want to implement policy. So definitely speak to your congressman or senator, yeah.
Great, and thank you both. I mean, that's what we try and do. So we hope that other people will take that up as well. So I think we have time for one more question as we're coming up on 3. Do you think the STEM workforce will now be in a disadvantage? And the person's reasoning is most of the job opportunities ask, do you need sponsorship of a visa now or anytime in the future? If we say yes, because eventually we will need sponsorship, then we don't hear back from them. If we say no, we are currently on STEM OPT and don't need anytime soon for about 3 years, eventually when we get a call back and we mention this, we still don't hear back. So to go back, do you think the STEM workforce will now be in disadvantage because of that?
I think absolutely. There's no question. I mean, I think the person that offered the comments at the question hit it spot on, is that we're sort of caught right now between two hard places.
as we're coming up? Do you guys want to give any closing remarks?
I think from my perspective, I really appreciate everyone's interest in all of this and all of the questions and comments, because part of this is to engage in this conversation, to educate each other, and then find these opportunities to amplify our voices. And when I say amplify our voices, it is talking to members of Congress, but it's also talking to university administrators, because they, frankly, if I'm going to be real about it, they're getting pressure from our federal government, from the FBI to quote unquote, do their part and be patriotic. And they need to hear from all of you that, look, there's two sides to this story, or not even two sides. There's a nuance here that we all have to understand. So if you make sure that the people within your spheres hear this, then we get to a better result, a more nuanced result.
Yeah, and I think I'll just add, that the more the government gets input from all the impacted stakeholders on a policy or program, the better the policy or program will be. And so that's something we look at routinely when we look at almost everything in the federal government does. We look at, how are they interacting with their stakeholders? Are they, are they getting comments? Are they considering all the implications? And then I think that's even more important when you're trying to be strategic in being competitive in these innovative areas, that, we need to be thinking about how to do this, across the government in a coordinated way.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you both for sharing your expertise and your background on international collaboration, immigration, and how it impacts the STEM workforce. Ben and I are really focused on this issue. We want to make sure that the American research enterprise is staying open and transparent, and there's collaboration. So if anybody has any concerns or issues or challenges they'd like to talk about, please feel free to reach out to ASBMB. John Neumann is an amazing reporter and researcher, and he understands these issues really in depth. And John Yang has a great legal expertise. So we've been very, very lucky in having them both on this webinar.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.